It was a cold autumn night when I received a notification for a new ride on my Uber app. It was past midnight, and I was about to end my shift, but I decided to accept this last trip. The streets were deserted, shrouded in a dense fog that swallowed the streetlights and cast eerie shadows everywhere. I pulled up to the designated spot, a dark corner between two abandoned buildings. My heart raced when I saw a figure emerging from the shadows. He was a tall, thin man, dressed in a black overcoat that seemed to swallow him whole. His face was partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see his eyes, cold, empty eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He got into the car without saying a word, and the air around him seemed to grow even colder. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and low, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "Take me to the old abandoned mill on Forest Road," he said. I hesitated. The mill was miles away in a remote area known for strange accidents. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "It's a long drive, and the road isn't the best, especially at night." He simply stared at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes glowing unnaturally in the darkness. "I'm sure," he replied, his voice now carrying an authority that brooked no arguments. I swallowed hard and started driving. As we left the city behind, I noticed the passenger couldn't stop fidgeting with his hands, his long, pale fingers twisting as if they had a life of their own. Every now and then, he muttered incomprehensible words, his breath forming small clouds in the car's cold air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the tires on the road and that unsettling murmur. I desperately wanted to strike up a conversation, anything to ease the tension, but something told me it was better to stay silent. Then he began to speak, his voice now clear and articulate, slicing through the silence like a knife. "Do you know the history of this place?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me through the rearview mirror. "Let me tell you about the souls who lost their lives on these roads." And so began the most terrifying ride of my life. The passenger's voice filled the car, cold and monotonous, as he began to recount his first story. 5 years ago, a young woman named Sarah decided to take a shortcut down this road. Her car broke down right there. He pointed to a dark spot on our right. She waited for hours, but no one passed by. When she tried to walk to the city, she was attacked. They found her body 3 days later, mutilated beyond recognition. I froze. I remembered that case. It had been news for weeks. He continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic tone. 2 years later, an entire family vanished on this same road. Their car was found abandoned, doors wide open. Blood covered the seats, but the bodies were never found. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I remembered that case too, and it remained unsolved to this day. But the worst, he whispered, leaning forward, was what happened last summer. A group of teenagers decided to camp near the mill. They say they heard screams all night but thought it was just a prank. In the morning, they found their friends, or what was left of them. They were dismembered, their organs arranged in a ritualistic pattern. I swallowed hard, vividly recalling the horrifying headlines. Investigations pointed to a cult, but no one was ever arrested. With each story, his voice grew more animated, almost ecstatic. His eyes glowed in the rearview mirror with a twisted delight. "And you know what's most fascinating?" he continued. "All these deaths have something in common. Witnesses reported seeing a tall, dark figure at the scenes, always watching, always present." My blood ran cold. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his tall, dark figure filling the back seat. He smiled, a grin that didn't reach his empty eyes. "But don't worry," he said, his voice now a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "The night is still young, and we have many more stories to tell before we reach our final destination." The weight of his words hit me like a punch. I realized with growing horror that I might be about to become the next story in his macabre repertoire. As we neared the old mill, the passenger grew strangely silent. The quiet was oppressive, almost suffocating. Then he spoke again, his voice now a raspy whisper that made my skin crawl. "You know, driver," he began, "there's something that all these stories have in common besides the mysterious figure." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. All the victims were like you, ordinary people, working late at night, trying to make an honest living. My heart raced. I tried to stay calm, but my hands shook on the steering wheel. You must be wondering why I'm telling you all this, he continued. The truth is, I have a very personal connection to these stories. I was there, in all of them. At that moment, I saw the mill come into view, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The passenger leaned forward, his cold breath on my neck. "Turn right here," he ordered. "There's a dirt road that leads to the back of the mill." I hesitated for a moment, but something in his voice left me with no other choice. I followed his instructions, driving into an even darker, more isolated area. "Stop the car," he commanded as we arrived at a clearing behind the mill. I turned off the engine, my whole body trembling. The passenger slowly got out of the car and I followed him as if in a trance. That's when I saw it. In the faint moonlight, I could make out shapes on the ground in the clearing. They were bodies, dozens of them, in various stages of decomposition. "Welcome to my playground," he said, his voice now dripping with a twisted joy. "All the drivers, all the innocent victims I've picked up over the years. And now, you'll join them." He turned to me, his eyes now glowing with a supernatural light, his face twisted into a demonic smile. In that moment, something inside me snapped. Fear gave way to pure adrenaline. In a swift move, I grabbed the key still in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. I don't know where I found the courage, but in an instant I was back at the wheel, speeding away from that nightmare. In the rearview mirror, I saw the passenger's figure fading away, his eyes glowing with fury. I drove like a madman back to the city, my heart threatening to leap out of my chest. I only stopped when I reached the police station, where I spilled my unbelievable story to the stunned officers. In the days that followed, the police scoured the area around the mill. They found evidence of sinister activities, but no sign of my macabre passenger. To this day, I don't know if he was human or something else. All I know is that I left my job as a driver and never drove at night again. Some rides are just not worth the risk. Finally, after months of searching, I had found the perfect house. Isolated, surrounded by nature, it was the ideal retreat to start my life over after the divorce. When the moving truck stopped in front of the rusty iron gate, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The house was more imposing than I remembered. Its dark stone walls loomed against the cloudy sky, the windows like empty eyes watching me. As we unloaded the boxes, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that hung in the air. No bird songs, no buzzing insects, just a sepulchral silence. It was at dusk that I saw it for the first time. The Raven's Garden. I was exploring the back of the property when I stumbled upon it. A vast space surrounded by gnarled trees, their bare branches stretching out like bony fingers towards the sky, and on each branch, on every available surface, ravens, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, their black gleaming eyes fixed on me, motionless, silent. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air became heavy, laden with an ancient, malevolent energy. I felt as if I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see, a dark secret that the house guarded jealously. That night, while unpacking, I heard it. The first sign that something was terribly wrong, a whisper, almost inaudible at first, coming from the walls. Incomprehensible words in a language I didn't recognize. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the wind or the house settling. But then the whispers turned into muffled groans, filled with pain and despair. I dashed to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing uncontrollably. That's when I noticed it. On the windowsill outside, a single raven perched, staring at me. Its eyes seemed to gleam with a sinister intelligence. I yanked the curtains shut, but the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, lying in bed and listening to the whispers and moans that seemed to come from every direction, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. This house, this garden, they were hiding something. Something ancient, something hungry. And I had just become a part of it. In the following days, I plunged into a frantic search for answers. The local library became my refuge, as I combed through old records and local history books. With every page turned, a chill ran down my spine. I discovered that the house had a dark history. Built in the 18th century by a wealthy merchant obsessed with the occult, it had been the site of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. But it was a small yellowed newspaper article that made my blood run cold. It spoke of a macabre ritual performed in the back garden where the ravens fed on the souls of the sacrificed. At night, the nightmares began. Terrifying visions haunted me. I saw myself in the garden surrounded by ravens. Their voices were not caws, but human screams of agony. Hooded figures encircled me, chanting in a forgotten language. And then, the sacrifice. I was the victim, my blood nourishing the earth, my soul being devoured by the ravens. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the screams still echoing in my ears, but the horror didn't end with waking. During the day I caught glimpses, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, figures in mirrors that weren't my reflection. Once, I swore I saw a hooded figure at the end of the hallway, but when I blinked, it vanished. One particularly restless night, the truth was revealed. Exhausted from days of sleepless nights, I fell into a deep slumber. In the dream, I was back in the garden, but this time it was different. An old man stood before me, his eyes as black as the ravens. "You live in the cursed house," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Centuries ago a pact was made here. Human souls in exchange for power and wealth. The ravens are the guardians, the soul collectors, and now they are waiting for you." I woke with a strangled cry, the realization hitting me like a punch. The curse, the ravens, the sacrifices, it was all connected. The house wasn't just a place, it was a living, hungry entity, and I was its next meal. I looked out the window. In the garden, the ravens were restless, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They knew I had uncovered the truth. And now, the question that terrified me was there any way to escape this nightmare? Or was I doomed to become just another soul devoured by the Garden of Ravens? The following days were a vivid nightmare. The visions intensified to an unbearable level. Dark shadows followed me throughout the house, whispering promises of eternal pain. The crows, once confined to the garden, now appeared everywhere, perched on furniture, tapping against the windows, their black eyes incessantly watching me. Desperate, I sought ways to break the curse. I consulted mediums, shamans, anyone who could offer help. I tried purification rituals, sprinkled salt at the entrances, burned sacred herbs. Nothing worked. With each failed attempt, the malevolent presence seemed to grow stronger, bolder. One night, I woke to the sound of wings beating furiously. I opened my eyes and froze in terror. My room was filled with crows, their eyes glowing with a supernatural light. In the center of the room, a hooded figure materialized, extending skeletal hands toward me. In a burst of adrenaline, I leaped out of bed and ran. I stumbled down the stairs, chased by a whirlwind of black feathers and inhuman screams. I reached the garden, my heart about to explode. There, under the moonlight, I saw the true extent of the horror. The garden's ground split open, revealing an abyss of pulsing darkness. Ancient voices echoed from the depths, calling for sacrifice. At that moment, I made a desperate decision. If the curse demanded a soul, it would have one, but it wouldn't be mine. With a defiant scream, I plunged into the center of the garden, not to surrender, but to confront the entity behind it all. I felt icy hands grabbing me, pulling me down. I fought with all my strength, focusing on a single thought: destroy the source of the curse. I don't know how long the battle lasted. It could have been minutes or centuries, but suddenly I felt something give. A deafening scream reverberated through the property, and a wave of energy exploded from the center of the garden. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the damp grass. The sun was rising on the horizon. The crows had vanished. The house, once imposing and threatening, now seemed merely an old, abandoned structure. I got up, trembling, hardly believing that I had survived. The curse seemed to have been broken, but at what cost? Part of me knew I would never be the same. The scars from that night would remain forever. As I walked away from the property, leaving behind the house and its terrible memories, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a single crow perched on the highest tree, its eyes fixed on me. A shiver ran down my spine. Had it really ended? Or had the curse merely found a new way to exist? These questions would haunt me for the rest of my days, just as the memories of the Garden of Crows would. I had always been a solitary man. My home, an ancestral relic inherited from my parents, felt more like a prison than a home. The house's walls held echoes of the past, and loneliness draped over me like a cold, oppressive shroud. One winter night, with the wind howling outside and the temperature plummeting, the cold seeped into every corner of the house. I was searching for something to pass the time, something to distract me from the constant monotony. That's when I went up to the attic, a part of the house I rarely visited. There, covered in a thick layer of dust, I found an old radio. It was a relic, with a dark wooden finish and knobs that seemed crafted for another era. There was something captivating about that radio, an inexplicable fascination that drew me in. I cleaned it carefully, almost with reverent respect. It had an unsettling presence, as if it held its own story, full of secrets and mysteries. When I turned it on, the radio emitted a characteristic sound, a deep crackle and the static of what seemed like a distant world. The static dominated the radio, an invisible wall of white noise that filled the room with a disconcerting sound. At first I found the static somewhat intriguing. It was as if the radio was trying to speak but couldn't. However, the constant white noise soon became an unexpected companion during my lonely nights. The initial nights were silent, with the radio just emitting that muffled, endless sound. I didn't pay much attention. After all, it was just an old radio, a remnant of a bygone era. But there was something about the way the radio whispered through the static that unsettled me, an indefinable sense that there was more behind that noise. And in those solitary, restless moments, I began to wonder if there was something more to that radio, something I hadn't yet discovered. What I didn't know at the time was that that radio, with its disturbing static and silent whispers, was about to plunge my life into an indescribable nightmare. The nights began to drag on with a growing sense of unease. As the clock struck midnight, something changed in the air. The radio, always still on its dusty shelf, began to emit a sound that went beyond mere static. It was a low, persistent whisper, almost like a voice trying to escape the clutches of the static. At first, the voice was muffled and almost indecipherable. I found myself leaning in towards the radio, trying to make out the words floating through the white noise. The words were fragmented, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I began to hear intimate details about my life, things no one else knew. Small memories, events I had buried deep, began to be revealed in a disturbing manner. The voice whispered about an argument I had with my father, a moment of anger I had sworn to forget. It spoke of a shameful secret I had hidden from my family, a past mistake that haunted me to this day. Each night, the radio dug deeper, uncovering increasingly dark and personal secrets. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just an illusion caused by my loneliness, but obsession took hold. The voice, once a mere whisper, became a constant presence, always at midnight. I started to anticipate those revelations, even though they left me increasingly disturbed. It was as if the radio was a dark mirror reflecting the deepest shadows of my soul. Paranoia set in. I felt like the voice was infiltrating my mind, knowing me better than I knew myself. Each secret revealed felt like a twisting knife, slicing through each layer of my sanity. I spent sleepless nights with the radio by my side, trying to understand what was happening, but the answer always seemed just out of reach. The obsession with the radio turned into a constant torment. I felt as though I was being watched by an invisible force that knew my fears and most intimate weaknesses. Each night was a new cycle of anxiety and terror, as the voice whispered secrets I never imagined could come to light. My life had become a nightmare, trapped in a cycle of obsession and fear. The radio, with its sinister and disturbing voice, was now the center of my existence, and I didn't know if I could escape its terrifying influence. As the weeks went by, the influence of the voice on the radio began to transform into something truly macabre. Initially, it was small transgressions. I found myself breaking minor rules I had set for myself. Things like stealing an antique piece of furniture from a flea market or lying to a friend about where I spent the night. The voice whispered insinuations, encouraging me to cross those fine lines between right and wrong. But soon, the voice became bolder and more demanding. It started to encourage me to commit serious crimes, suggesting violent and cruel acts that shocked me. I believed I was losing my mind, that all of this was a delusion created by my own disturbed psyche. I tried to ignore the whispers, but the pressure was overwhelming. It was as if the voice was implanting thoughts in my head, each one harder to resist. The terror reached its peak one fateful night. The voice had become a constant hammer, pounding my head with commands and taunts. I was exhausted and desperate, my sanity slipping away by the moment. In a moment of desperation, the voice urged me to commit a horrible act, a crime that surpassed all boundaries of what I had imagined myself capable of. I, in a state of complete loss of control, succumbed to those orders. The act I committed was a stain on my soul, a mistake so monstrous that I could not forgive myself. As the night passed and reality hit me again, I found myself consumed with regret and horror. The feeling of guilt was overwhelming, and I was mired in a sea of hopelessness. However, something unexpected happened. When the clock struck the next midnight, the radio stopped working. The voice stopped abruptly, and the silence that filled the room was deafening. The radio, now useless, seemed like an empty shell, no longer the sinister sound that had haunted my days and nights. That morning, with my mind still clouded by the trauma, I decided to investigate the origin of that radio. What I discovered was more disturbing than I could have imagined. The radio had belonged to someone who mysteriously disappeared years ago, a man with a dark past and involved in heinous crimes. The connection between that radio and the disappearance of its former owner turned out to be more sinister than I could understand. The voice on the radio seemed to originate directly from the darkness of the man's past, a past that seemed to have found a new target in my life. The final truth about the radio and its influence left an indelible mark on me. That old radio was not just an antique piece, but a gateway to a nightmare beyond comprehension. As I struggled to reclaim my life, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. And so ends the terrifying tale of the radio that revealed dark secrets and led a man to commit indescribable acts. The line between sanity and chaos can be thinner than we imagine, and true horror can hide in the most unexpected places. If you found these stories as disturbing as I did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more real horror tales that will send chills down your spine. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your feedback is crucial to us and helps shape the content you enjoy the most. And remember, the nightmare doesn't end when you wake up. Until next time, if you have the courage to face more mysteries and horrors.